Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Marta and Paulo for the invitation to be here. It was a pleasure to participate in this book. It's an excellent book with lots of data, and the whole project was very interesting. As you saw, all chapters were based on the census data that was put together by a research group. And that was a very interesting project. So I'll be talking about education and income inequality in Brazil. This chapter is co-authored by Charles Kirschbaum from INSPER. I'm also at the University of São Paulo. And it's in the more traditional line that looks at income inequality. So it's basically trying to use the data, the census data from the 60s to give a long-run view of the relationship between education and inequality in Brazil. So by means of a quick introduction, we all know that inequality is still very high in Brazil, despite the reduction in the last 15 years. And average years of education was also low until the late 90s. And in this presentation and in the chapter, we tried to give an overview of how inequality evolved over the last 40 years. And we have data on education for the 1960 census, so we look at 50 years of evolution of education. And then we tried to put together a framework whereby the interaction between demand and supply for education affect wage differentials and then income inequality. So basically, in this chapter, we try to understand how the evolution of the supply of education impacted the education wage differentials, which in turn impacted inequality. Okay, there are a series of caveats here. First of all, we treat the supply of education as exogenous, so we don't try to explain. We don't have a model that explains the supply of education. We don't try to explain the evolution of the demand for education as well. And also, we treat education groups as separate entities. So we don't have in this chapter a structural model whereby all the education groups interact. It's a very simplified and descriptive view of what happens, as I thought this would fit well in the book. Okay? So, for example, I think one of the main features of Brazil education is that it took a long time to evolve in a decent way. For example, the 1980 cohort, those that were born in 1980 here in the US, had 14 years of education, whereas in Brazil, it had only 9 years of education, which was what those born in 1900 in the US gained. So Brazil was like 80 years behind the US in terms of education achievement. And this is one of the most important features that we all must keep in mind. Also, income inequality is still very high. The 10% richest have income 50 times higher than the 10% poorest. Gini coefficient still among the highest in the world. And now, more recently, we have this new tax records data that show that inequality is even higher than we used to think using the PNAD, all the research that used the PNAD all these years. So some studies say that the 1% richest earn 25% of total income when you take into account all measures of income, including in the tax record. So basically, how did we arrive in this situation of really high inequality in Brazil? So this is a picture that summarizes income inequality in Brazil. This is the income ratio of those. The green line is someone in the 90th percentile as compared to someone in the 10th percentile of the income distribution. So it's the 90-10 ratio. And it was 11 in 1970, which was already increasing as compared to the 60, according to Langoni's book. And then it continued increasing until the 2000, and then it declined from 2000 to 2010. So this is a picture of increasing income inequality until 2000, and then a strong reduction between 2000 and 2010. And this has happened both in the 90-50 ratio, but also in the 50-10 ratio. The 50-10, the blue line, there is a strong reduction as well, but it's difficult to see because of the scale of the graph. So inequality reduced a lot in the last decade. So just to say briefly about this reduction in inequality in the last few years, most of it was due to what happened in the labor market. Conditional cash transfers were important to reduce poverty, but not so much inequality. So in order to understand this inequality reduction, we would have to look into the labor market. And most studies show that the minimum wage and education, increase in education supply, are factors that are important for explaining this reduction in income inequality recently. But in this chapter, we will look at the history of education. We will not concentrate on the most recent period, okay? I have a separate paper that looks at the role of minimum wage for the most recent period, and it seems that it's very important. So basically, I think this is the most important figure. If you have this picture is the education evolution in Brazil, according to the data. And you see that in 1960, here, you have more than 70% of the population in 1960 had 0 to 3 years of education. So basically, they were illiterates. So I think this is one of the most distinctive features of this data and to understand the Brazilian society and evolution. You have, even in 1960, 72% with basically no education. And then you have another 20% which had from 4 to 7 years of education, incomplete secondary education. And then those that achieved high school or college education, they represent a tiny minority of the population in Brazil. So only about 2% reach high school and 1% reach college in 1960. So when we look at the education wage differentials, we can understand why those 1% have a really high income. That explains a lot of income inequality in Brazil, okay? Over time, we can see that there was an improvement in terms of education. This 72% share decreases over time, reaching about 20% in 2000. And you see the increase in the secondary education and high school. And the share with college education is very small and evolves very slowly over time. It only increases at a faster rate between 2000 and 2010, okay? But the high school education is the most recent and most important phenomenon that explains the fall in inequality in Brazil, is this increase in the share of people with high school education, which moved from 15% of the population in 1990 to 30% of the population in 2010. Okay, so this evolution occurred. It was very slow as compared to other countries, other developing countries, such as South Korea, Chile, Argentina, and but eventually, between 2000 and 2010, we had a significant progress in terms of education. And the question is this progress responsible for the fall in inequality that occurred over this period? Okay. In terms of the relative supply of education, so we look in most economic models, we look not only at the levels of education, but at the relative levels of education. And in relative terms, you see this is the green triangle, is the share of high school as compared to secondary education in Brazil. It was 0.8, then the ratio was 1, meaning the same number of high school and secondary. And this was pretty much stable until 2000, and then it shoots up between 2000 and 2010. So in relative terms, the high school education increased a lot as well in 2000 and 2010. But together with supply, we must look at the wage differentials, okay? Because the supply of education combined with the wage differentials determine income inequality. So you can see that even in 1970, this is the wage differential between someone with college education and someone with high school education. So a small proportion of the population had a college education, and those that had income 2.5 times higher than those with high school education. So this is a very high number in terms of wage differential, expressed here in terms of ratio, okay? And you can also see that in 1970, it was very important to have the basic education. So this is the blue line here. It is only for primary education. So returns to primary education were very high as well in the 1970s. Why? Because very few people had primary education. So returns to primary education was quite high. And high school returns were really small. Why? Because very few people had, and high school was not important. There was not a lot of demand for high school education at that period. But as we move through time, you can see that the returns to primary education declines over time. So it's very, very small here in 2010. And also returns to secondary education also declines over time. So what we argue in the paper is that the increase in the supply of people with primary education and with secondary education led to the fall in the returns to primary and returns to secondary education. So in 1970, high school, the returns to high school were the smallest. When you move to 2010, returns to high school is higher than primary and secondary, which are really, really small. So you don't make a lot of money by progressing from primary to secondary education or high school education in Brazil. You have to go to college education, which is this huge wage differential here that still persists. Despite the increase in college supply that we saw, wage differentials still, they reached 3 times. So it's like 200% in 2010, okay? So the same thing happens, we did separately for women only. You also see this rise in returns to college education and fall in the other returns. And we also did for blacks and browns, mulattoes, and we also have this increase in college and decline in the others. So it seems that there are some differences, but the basic pattern remains the same, okay? So basically, what I try to say is, in this picture, is try to look at the interactions between supply and demand. So you can see, if you look at the ratio between those with primary education and the illiterates, in this axis we have the wage ratio, and here is the supply ratio. As supply increases, the wage differential reduces, okay? Up to, whenever this line has a negative slope, it means that the supply is the increase in supply is consistent with the reduction in wages. So you see reduction of wage differentials here up to 2000. We cannot explain the 2000 to 2010, and this, in my opinion, is due to the minimum wage, okay? So despite a reduction in the relative supply, wages also decline. The same thing here, 8 to 10 as compared to 4 to 7 years of education. You see increase in supply with a drop in the wage differentials. In high school, it's difficult to explain this period here, but then from 2000 and 2010, we also see an increase in supply leading to reduction in wage differentials. And the college education is a different picture altogether. There's very little movement if you look at the scale here. But it basically, to summarize the picture, I would say that there is an increase in demand for college education that tends to increase wage differentials despite the small increase in the supply that took place over the period. So just to summarize, basically the chapter tells the following story. Inequality increased a lot. Income inequality increased a lot up to 2000 and then declined. And we try to point out in a very descriptive way that wage differentials could explain part of this process. Why? Because there was an increase in the supply of education over the period, especially secondary education and high school education. And this has led to a decline in the education wage differentials, which could explain part of the reduction of income inequality. This very simple framework cannot explain the behavior of some wage differentials. For example, high school, there was an increase in demand for high school between 1998 and 2000. College, wage differential, there also seems to have had an increase in the demand for college workers between 2000 and 2010. And also, there was a reduction in wage differentials associated with primary education in 2000, despite the reduction in supply, which we think could be explained by the minimum wage. So, what are the policy implications of this analysis? So, returns to college education are still very high in Brazil, as you saw, and still increasing if you compare 2000 to 2010. So if you want to further reduce inequality by means of education, you should increase access to college education. And some other studies show that it's especially important to increase access to engineering course, medical courses, which were the ones that had a small increase in the last 10 years. And then, as we talked in the first session, these good times of reduction of inequality, reduction of unemployment, informality, that all took place in the 2000s, seems to have come to an end. So it's important to discuss whether the economic crisis that we're going to face, that we are facing the next few years, might provoke a reversion of this process with increase in income inequality. And if this happens, where that will take us back in the past. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nair. So we'll turn now to Carlos.
Okay. So let's change again. It's very nice. It looks super clear. So. I also would like to thank Marta for organizing all this and Paulo for organizing this gathering and the opportunity to talk to you. You know, I contributed with 2 chapters for this volume, and I will talk mainly about one, but if I have time, I will just give some hints on the second one because they are related somehow. In a way, my presentation should be before Nair's, because I'm talking about inequality in access to education. So education explains, you know, a lot of, as we saw, what happened with inequality, with income inequality and other kinds of inequality, but it's also affected by the inequality in the previous generation of parental households and etc. So the idea here is to see how these characteristics of the parents of youth and kids and children affect the chances of this youth progressing along the educational system. So we call this in general inequality of educational opportunity, and that's what we are going to talk about. I'm going to talk about here. So as in all other papers in this, most of the papers in this book, we use the census data. So the idea was to use this data. So I use this data, you know, all the census from the 60 to 2010, and it's important to understand, you know, all of you know, but just to remember that this is a period of huge change in Brazil. So if we think in 1960, 60% of the population was rural, then in 2010 only 12%. So it's in a very short, you know, relatively short period of time, the society changed a lot. This is just an indication of all other change that happened in the society. So let's see how do we know there was a big expansion of the educational system in Brazil, and it was slow when compared to other countries in the world, not only in the North Hemisphere, but also in Latin America. So Brazil is a latecomer, so in terms of educational expansion. And we are going to talk about, I'll show the expansion a little bit, it's more or less what Nair have shown, but also the transitions. in education. So the educational system is just like a funnel. So to make one transition, you need to make the first one. So the population is decreasing. The population that's that can do the transfer. You enter in the school. Only those who enter in the school can complete primary education and the first cycle of primary education and so on and so forth until the end of the educational the system. So that's what we talk about 7 transitions here. Our data is better to talk about the first transitions because we are dealing with the census has information about the household. So we are dealing with kids who still live in the household of their parents. This is a limitation of this paper, but we do the maximum we can with that. So the transitions are first entering in the educational system, then complete the first cycle of primary education, 4 years of education, which was mandatory until 71. After 71, it was 8 years of education, mandatory. So then the third transition is complete secondary cycle of primary education, then enter secondary education, complete secondary education, enter college and complete college. So those are the transitions, and we can see here's not the transition, here's the progression of the system in each one of these levels. For example, where's okay, here. Okay. So here we see, for example, is the amount of youth who enter enter school. So you see that more or less 40% didn't enter school even in the 1960s. Never step in a school. So or at least didn't finish the first grade of school. So and then you see that there is this big increase here, in the and here almost everyone is in school, and then these are the other levels. Like 4 years of education, then 8 years of education, and so forth. And secondary, and as you see here, to enter college is very, very few people entered, and this is how the education expanded across time. So what we do then is to analyze each one of these transitions based on a series of variables that are available in the census. So we use the sex, race, region, family structure, family income, and mother's education to explain these transitions. And so we are going to analyze in these terms. So let's see what happened for primary education. Is the 3 first transitions. So this is the rate of this is the transition rates. So people who entered school, it increased a lot. Then these are those who entered school who completed 4 years of education. So this is the tendency here. Now,
what does the lines mean?
oh, the lines is because we did the analysis for different age groups. Okay. In order to, I didn't explain that, it's too many things, but the tendencies are the same line, direction. Then this is for completing the 8 grades of schooling. So you see it's what happened. And then we try to explain these transitions based on the independent variables we have here. So, and the conclusions we arrive is the following: inequality in terms of family income, mother education, residence in rural area, and race diminished constantly in all these transitions. So it's a good thing that happened. The inequality in access to primary education declined a lot in terms of these variables, which are very important. This women had always had advantage over men, but this declined across the period. This is a strange thing we have to investigate more, because in general, in early years, men had advantage over men in other countries, and then this changed at some point. So in Brazil, at least using the census data, this happened all along, and this diminished along the time. And for secondary education, what did we find? For secondary education, we have these transitions, the transition entering secondary education and completing secondary education. And here, there is more constancy than change. Inequality in terms of residence in the rural area and race declined along the period, but then women had advantage over men again, but then inequality in terms of family income and mother's education remained constant across the period. I see people with mothers with more years of education and families with higher income had the same advantage in 1960 and in 2010 to enter and complete secondary education. So the inequality of opportunity remained constant across the period. And then the entrance in college and completion of college. So these are the trends for entering college, and these are the trends for completing college. Only I mean, I can explain this if I have more time. And then what we find, this is interesting too, we find that inequality in terms of residence in rural area and race declined across this period. Women had advantage over men. This also declined across the time, but then for entering college, we find that inequality in terms of family income and mother's education remained constant until the 80s, and from 1960 to 1980, and then increased from 91 to 2010. That means people whose mothers were more educated and had more higher income, or whose family had higher income, had better chances to enter college. So there is an increase in inequality at this period, in spite of the expansion of tertiary education. So if there was no expansion, the inequality would probably be even higher here. And for completing college, in terms of family income and mother education, remained constant across time. So these are the main findings we have for these transitions using this data. So it's very interesting. The conclusion is that there is reduction of inequality in primary education, constant inequality in secondary education, and a little increase of inequality to enter college since 1991. So this is the first paper. These are overall conclusions. I just repeating here, racial inequality and sex. I mean, it's just what I said before, But in this paper, what we see is like this transition is what we call the vertical stratification, is how people progress along the system. So what we don't see here is that there is heterogeneity inside each one of these systems, these levels of education. They are not all the same quality. One of the things we know is, for example, in elementary education or primary education in general, private schools are better than public schools. This is one way of measuring quality, not a very good one, but it's the one we have sometimes. In secondary education, it's the same. And then in tertiary education in Brazil, public universities are in general better than private universities. So we have this difference that is horizontal also. I'm talking here in terms of private and public, but there are other kinds of heterogeneity in these levels. So the census data allows us to look a little bit for, it's the only data we have that shows the careers people completed education at the tertiary level. So we can look a little bit at the university, how is the horizontal stratification. So in a second chapter, we did a little bit of that. I'm just going to present it quicker here. What happened? This is the tendency of people who completed college. So you have here along the time you have that very little women completed college in 1960, but they increased, and they are more than men here. In 91, there was this reversion. Men declined, as women increase, men decline. And these are the racial composition of people who completed college. So mostly white, but this is declining. And then you have other people here, black, brown, and Asian, and etc. So you have, with the expansion of tertiary education, you have more women entering and disadvantaged racial groups entering also. And then this is the percentage of women in each one of these, in different careers, you see? So you see that here in general, engineering, medicine, and law, there are more men than women in general, but women are catching up, entering this along the years, along the decades. And in humanities, you had humanities and social science more women, but then also this is changing a long time. So in general, what one finding that one thing that we found here is that women who enter and complete college, in general, they complete less prestigious careers than men. Although they had this big expansion, like more women than men entering college and completing, in general, they enter in more prestigious careers, and this will reflect in their income and etc. And let's see. And here is then we have here the mean earnings in each one of these careers. And again, you see, there is in humanities and social sciences where women are entering, and most of black and brown are entering in these careers here. You know, they are entering careers who had smaller salaries as a reward. And then men continue to enter more in these careers which have higher salaries and things like that. So this is to give us some ideas about, I'm not presenting everything here, I don't have time, about this second chapter. So some conclusions, the general conclusions are, there is an impressive increase in the participation of women, black and brown in higher education from 1960 to 2010. Women are increasingly concluding higher prestige careers. They are getting there, but less than men still. Therefore, the gender inequality is decreasing, but still high. But the increasing participation of browns and blacks is concentrating in lower prestige careers. Income inequality is high across careers. That means that, there is horizontal stratification. Mean income is higher in careers with more whites and males in general. And income inequality between men and women declines along this period. Income inequality among differential groups does not decline along different racial groups does not decline along the period. And then the general conclusions here, huge expansion of the educational system, although a late expansion, but it's a very significant expansion. Decline in inequality of educational opportunity at primary level education during the period. Continuity of this kind of inequality in secondary level. Increase for entering college after 1991. At higher education, black and brown conclude mainly lower prestige degree, and women are slowly concluding higher prestige careers. Income inequality across degrees of higher education remain high across the period. And those are thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you both for keeping it close to the time. And David?
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I really want to thank Paolo for inviting me, because by inviting me, he made me aware of this book, which I didn't know about. And I really enjoyed getting it and looking at it and learning about it. So I'm talking about both of the papers. And as Carlos suggested, it makes sense to do them in the other order, so I'm going to do them in the other order. I just first want to make a few overall comments about the whole book. I love it. Parabéns a Marta and the whole team. I think it's it was a great idea to do this, and it was implemented extremely well. And it's the kind of thing that, I gave a presidential address to the Population Association a few years ago, which was kind of similar in theme of 50 years looking back at the whole world. And Brazil is a great place to look back, and I'm the kind of person, I have all the Brazilian censuses and 35 years of PNAD data on my laptop. So I think, looking at these data is extremely important. So Brazil, this is something you can't do, as Marta suggested at the beginning, for very many countries. This is a documented history of economic development, probably unparalleled in the world for an extremely important and fascinating country. To be able to go back to 1960 and have this kind of rich micro data is amazing. So it was a great idea, as exactly as Marta said in the introduction. There's a lot of papers, there's a lot of great work out there. We're looking at all the pieces, but to pull it all together, I think was a brilliant idea and extremely successfully executed. I didn't read every paper in detail. I read these papers in detail, and they're, to me, kind of the epitome of what the whole point of it was, to pull the data and see what could be learned. So both the presentations were excellent. I gave you a very clear, they're very nice papers with very clear questions, very effective use of the data, come to very interesting answers with, a few nuances, but kind of a very clear picture emerges. And I want to kind of go through them in reverse order and try to kind of pull them together, as is kind of obvious that they fit together very nicely. So the paper Carlos presented documents these large improvements in the distribution of schooling. To do that, it implies large improvements in these transitions. The only way to improve schooling is everybody's moving along, and the focus is on these transitions. And the question is, have these disparities in these school progression transition rates by various things, gender, race, income, et cetera, changed over time? And you saw this story. This is a graph that Carlos put up, just showing the big changes in the distribution of schooling, looked at from the perspective of those who are 21 to 25, and he went through that. It is, as both Nercio and Carlos said, slow by some international standards, but nonetheless by the end, an amazing change in the schooling distribution. I wanted to show it in some other ways. So these are some data I produced. This now, instead of the younger population, is the roughly working age population that I just happen to have at my fingertips at 20 to 59. We'll call it working age. So it roughly corresponds to Nercio's paper. And here's what the schooling distribution in single years of schooling looked like in 1960. So for the adult population, over 40% with no schooling, and a bit of a spike at 4, and then hardly anybody. Beyond that, this is what it looks like by 2012. So it's just a completely different picture. I like to look at these cumulative distributions, so I'm going to do some of these and show you a number of them because I think they're just an interesting way to look at it. So this is the cumulative distribution. So for example, by 1960, that tells us that the 50th percentile was reached at 1 year of schooling. That was the median. The 90th percentile was reached at 4 years of schooling. So you already accounted for 90% of the distribution by then, and that's how you can read these. If we go over time, I'm now pulling in some PNAD data here, which is why we've got these other years. 76, 99, and then I go all the way to 2012, which was the last PNAD I had on my laptop. And by 2012, we now have the 70th fifth percentile at 11 years of schooling. The 90th percentile we don't reach until we get to 15 years of schooling. So just an amazing distribution. So going down is good in the way these things work. So I'm going to show you a few more of these. But I first want to make the point, so I'm also a demographer as well as an economist, and I've been very interested in the demography of this period. And it's important to keep in mind that this was a period when the school-age population approximated here, given some 5-year age groups I had to work with in the UN data, by the 5 to 19 population, but it doesn't matter too much, was growing incredibly fast. So it's really amazing to realize that these sort of biggest improvements in the schooling distribution ever in Brazil, and the same is true pretty much all over the world, happened at a time when the school-age population was growing at the beginning at almost 4% a year through the whole period at least 2% a year. The school-age population doubled between 1960 and 1990, a period when schooling increased enormously. One of the reasons for that was that fertility was falling from the 1960s, as is discussed in the demographic chapter later in the book that's not being presented today. It's a very fast fall in fertility, about as fast as anywhere in the world, from 6 children per woman down to now below replacement, below 2, or right around 2, depending on the data source. But you know, complete fertility transition over this same period. And one of the interesting things about that, I've done some work with Leticia Martoletto looking at the fact that the families were getting smaller. So kids actually had fewer kids to compete with at home, but they had more kids to compete with in the school-age population, and you had these interesting competing trends until the school-age population peaks in the early 90s and has basically stopped growing and will probably never grow again. So it's interesting in terms of what's happening to schooling. It's now much easier to now focus on school quality, close the remaining gaps that there are, but it's an interesting background. So Carlos showed you some of these graphs. This one sort of leaped out at me. It's one of the starkest changes. This is the kind of thing they look at, this probability of finishing grade 8, conditional on finishing grade 4. We see this huge increase, and it's one of the things that really pushes the distribution up. And then they have a lot of these regressions. He didn't show you these, but these are kind of what the things are based on, these odds ratios. You can see here for women, you said the female advantage went down, and I was surprised you said that. I mean, it goes down here a little bit, but actually is higher overall. But anyway, it sort of goes up and goes down. But in this case, for these younger women, there's a female advantage from the beginning, even in 1960, and it kind of continues, goes up and then goes back down a little bit. For the Pardo group, I'm just going to show a graph about that. This is a odds ratio of 1/2, so a huge disadvantage. Anything below 1's a disadvantage, almost completely disappearing by the end for these young people. I wanted to show something similar using these cumulatives. This is what happens. This is for the adult population. So the young population, of course, is kind of the vanguard pushing the change. For the adult population, females were still lagging behind in 1960. So the fact that this female curve is above the male when the females were actually still lagging behind, especially at the bottom here. So 50% of females had less than 0, while only 40% of males had 0. But then over time, so we're going to jump all the way to 2012. The change is enormous, and females now are advantaged all the way across the distribution by 2012. So that's what's happening to the female advantage over time. And this happens in much of Latin America, as people probably know, that female schooling passed male schooling back in the 60s and 70s and has stayed that way. This is just the Bronco versus Pardo comparison. So this one is very stark to begin with. So over 60% of Pardo had 0 schooling in 1960. Whites were much better off. This gap closes a lot. And one of the reasons I wanted to put these up, they basically show the same thing. What they're looking at are kind of these slopes along the way, or sort of the probability of getting to here given that you got to here. It's kind of what they're looking at. And I just wanted to make the point that it's kind of useful to then go back and sort of put it back together again and look at the whole distribution. So here you see the big increase. This big spike here is the jump to 11. So that's where the biggest spike in the distribution is at 11. So it's a huge change and a big closing of the gap here, kind of all the way. But as was pointed out, this university gap still quite big here in the by race. Okay, so tying that into the paper I had just a few points. One is this issue about, is the meaning of race changing over time? We're looking at it as a change in the advantage. Maybe it's a change in self-classification, always an issue in Brazil. I don't have anything profound to say about that. I think this point's wrong, so I'm not going to say it. Has to do with, but other than the point that the distribution, as they make in the paper, the distributions are changing a lot. So the advantage of mothers having primary education compared to 0 isn't as interesting as you go along, because it starts to become a very small group. What's wrong is that this actually isn't what happens with their university completion. It's really at the higher levels that the action is. And then just this point that the transitions are very interesting, but it's good to look at the completed levels. Turning to the paper by Nercio, we're looking at how did these big changes in the distribution of schooling relate to the distribution of income or labor income earnings. And it's this kind of race, as has been explored in literature in the US and other countries, between the supply of education increasing and the changes in demand for education as we look at the wage differentials. And basically the story of their paper is that most of what we see is consistent with, as the education distribution shifts into higher years of education, the returns to those higher years of education start to fall. And so this is what's happening to inequality, as Nercio showed. I thought you might be interested. I got interested in this. A lot of the reasons I have these data on my laptop is I'm comparing Brazil and South Africa. I've been working in South Africa a lot lately. These are Gini coefficients from the PNAGI data, so a different measure of inequality, a different data source. But basically, the story that's pretty well known of kind of, I don't know, call it constant. These are high inflation years. There's kind of some question about what that means, but the clear decline here over time. Now, I got interested in South Africa at the when apartheid ended, which was when the data start, and they were very similar, and they were the two most unequal countries in the world. It's one of the reasons I got interested in South Africa. And South Africa has not had a decline, and it's a big focus of attention in South Africa. Why did Brazil have a decline and not South Africa? I'm not going to say any more about that, but it is an interesting issue. And I think education is actually the explanation in both places because they've gone different ways. So the focus is on these ratios, these returns to education, and you can see the very big ratio of having university compared to high school that's extremely high and actually goes up, whereas the others are mostly going down. I want to, and then the story here. This one's sort of the cleanest one for the 8 to 10 to 4 to 7, where we see as these numbers get bigger, the number of 8 to 10-year-olds compared to 4 to 7-year-olds is increasing, eventually getting to about equality at the end, and explained by a supply side story, the returns to having 8 to 10 compared to 4 to 7 keep going down. Now they're not all that pretty, but that's kind of the overall story. That it looks like it's, as you get relatively more of this education group, its returns in the labor market decline. This is another way of looking at, this is just a graph of log earnings relative to zero schooling. So this is just showing earnings going up. These are big, so from 0 to 1 is over a 25% increase in earnings. So by international standards in 1976 is when I started working on inequality in Brazil. These are, like 20% returns per year on average, with some little blips here that probably aren't that interesting. And then very steep at the top, and this is the college premium. What happens over time is that this thing becomes flatter. And that's exactly what their graphs show in a different way. This is just sort of putting it all together again. And so the returns to having 4 are much less here than they were up here. The returns to having 8, this 4 to 8 jump, say, is much flatter here than it was here. In general, this is much flatter and ends up being very steep at the top. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to show this graph is because you get something here that you kind of have trouble reconstructing in Nercio's graphs, which is that although the returns to college are at least as high and perhaps higher here than they were up here, looking at logs, you get a little different story than the levels that they're looking at because of the rising inequality at the top, but that's another story. But basically, returns to university are still very high. But that's university compared to, say, high school. But if you look at university compared to, say, 0 or 4 or even 8, returns are actually down. That is, the advantage of having university education relative to the whole rest of the schooling distribution is actually lower now. And that's because it sort of has to be, because all these have gotten flatter. And if it were going to still be up here, this thing would have to be jumping all the way up to there. And it's not. So it is, returns to education are very high. They may have even, to university are very high. They may have even gone up. But because these are also much flatter, these guys actually end up lower than they used to appear relative to the bottom. Just a couple of other points here. Oh, my bubbles. I wanted to do my bubbles because that's the one I want to end on. So what you miss with this is where is the distribution of education? Where are people? And basically, there's hardly anybody up here. And you tend to just sort of focus on the returns. And so Austin Davis, who couldn't make it here, who's been helping me with this stuff, his flight was canceled. And I started playing with these bubbles. So these are bubble graphs. The width of the circle is proportional to the proportion in the population. So in 1956, everybody's down here. And in fact, I calculated the Gini coefficient for the population with less than 8 years, or less than or equal to 8 years in 1976. It's not that much lower than the Gini coefficient for the whole population. So we tend to think of inequality as being, you know, these very rich, well-off people up here and a lot of poor people, but you can just take them out of there, and inequality is still very high, because it's coming from these very steep returns down here at the bottom. And as Nercio said, you know, having 4 years of education was a big deal. And this is even starting in 1976 rather than 1960 as he was doing. There's 11. And so now if you bring in 2012, it looks like that. So it's the same line as before, but now turned into bubbles. And so here's this huge group at 11, and now everybody's over here. And it's a very different picture. I'm going to come back to this in 1 second. I just have a couple more slides. This is to show what's happened to the male-female gap and how the returns differ. And so there's males and females in 1976. This difference here is the male-female wage gap. This is now relative to women with 0. And so this is a huge gap here. It's almost a full log point, so like a doubling or tripling of wages. And this is what happens in 2012. So we see this flattening for both groups, still very steep at the top, and a big decline in the gender gap that actually gets a little narrower even at the high levels, related to very much to the points about the higher education. Okay, so just a few points. I thought this analysis was very persuasive, very interesting, a very, as Nercio presented it, very clear story. As they know, just because the relative wage declines when the relative supply increases doesn't mean there weren't any demand side effects, so we shouldn't rule them out. They're just dominated by the supply side part of the story. And as with the education paper, I just wanted to make the point that it's good to go back from these transitions. Both of them are kind of focused on these transitions back to the big picture. And I think to put it all together, it's kind of what you get from the two papers, and in some ways what you get from the whole book. I want to put my bubbles back up again. So I think a way to summarize what's happened to Brazil in this incredible period, and this is even just starting at 76 rather than 60, is a change from this country to this country, beginning with low levels of education and very high returns to having even 4 years or 8 years of education, and that producing a lot of inequality. Over time, as groups moved into these levels of education, you know, they would have wished they'd gotten these returns, but as people moved into these higher levels of education, the returns went down. I think the supply side story that Nercio suggests is quite compelling, and you would expect, given that huge a change, these returns fell and still stayed pretty much at the high levels because the supply side effects have not been as big. And I think as their results show, there's also demand side things going on, as all over the world. There's big returns to, increasing returns to college education that are kind of offsetting the supply side effects. In terms of, you know, these declines in returns to schooling here, are they good or bad for inequality? Well, in a sense, they're good, but on the other hand, if you gave these people at 8 years of education this level of return, it would actually reduce inequality a lot. Those are now low-wage people. In 1976, they were in probably the top 10% of the income distribution. They're now way below the median. And we've been working on that a bit in explaining these South Africa-Brazil differences. But I think they're very nice papers. It's a very nice story. I think education is a huge issue in terms of understanding what's happening in income inequality, and I really enjoyed the papers. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for those wonderful comments. Let's take a round of questions, guys.
Thank you. Carlos Lins Silva with FAPESP. It's a question for Naercio. Naercio, I won't dispute your data with anecdotal evidence. But my empirical, non-systematic perception is that a person with a college degree earns much more than 3 times more than a person in high school. At the same time, we all know thousands of college degree people who are working in jobs that don't require college qualification, and many are unemployed at all. So how do you reconcile your data, which I'm sure are sound, with this perception? Or is this perception totally irrelevant? Or is it the case that perhaps so many fewer people have earnings that are so high, and many more have earnings that are so low that the average makes 3 times? Is that the solution for this matter?
Okay, other questions? Yep.
Well, this was really interesting, and I love the graphs. A long time ago, it used to be said that the returns for moving to São Paulo were much higher than the returns to education. And there's a certain kind of tracking of the process of urbanization with the processes that you're talking about. If one looks at municipal level education data, and I've read a few papers whose authors I can't remember, that do this, there are signs that there's a huge sort of movement of more educated people. There's a tendency of people to go away to college and never come back. So that when you're looking at municipal level data, you may have in various states an enormous concentration of people with education in the capital or in a few large cities, and very, very few, even in absolute numbers, remaining in the majority of other municipalities in these regions. How does looking sort of at a kind of disaggregated geographical sense at these data affect the way that you see these trends?
Going else?
Thank you so much for the very interesting panel. I have 2 questions. First question is about the college admission rate in Brazil. So I wonder if you have any data about the admission rate at the college level. I'm asking because I saw some data about this information in China recently. So you see a very interesting trend, from the entire 50s, 60s until almost like 80s. The college admission rate in China is almost like between 20 and 30. 30 is the highest. But actually from 2000, it becomes really high, over 50, now it's almost 70. But interestingly, around 2000 is also the year when you see more income inequality in China. So, I begin to think about the correlation between college admission or actually higher level of education versus income inequality. So I wonder, do you have any data about college admission rate in Brazil and how that can play into the picture of inequality? The second thing is just a very, factual question out of my interest in Brazil. So for people living in the huge informal settlements in the urban areas, like in the favelas and stuff like that, do children have equal access to education as children in the formal communities? Thanks.
Let me take advantage of my prerogative as chair to ask a question, 2 questions actually. The first would be just comparatively, what would this look like in the OECD countries, this particular line that you have for 2012? I'm wondering comparatively in wealthier countries what we should expect to see. The second question is policy related, and that is as the returns to higher education decline, which is, if I understand correctly, what we should see, what does that mean about policies such as the policies followed in recent years that try to expand access to higher education. Obviously, there are plenty of reasons to do that that have nothing to do with the, inequality, but I'm just curious if you could speak to that.
Hi, Miguel Carter. I was intrigued, very intrigued a couple of years back, doing research on inequality for a book I recently published on the subject in Brazil, to discover a study that was produced by the, I forget the actual acronym, the UN Development Study Center that's lodged in IPEA, and it was produced by Kakwani, the Indian director of that center. In which he provided a graph that sort of blew my mind because it went against much of the standard discourse about inequality falling in Brazil. And he came up with these two, I now realize are rather well-established measures of relative and absolute inequality. And so he showed as the Gini declined that absolute inequality during the same period of the 2000s actually increased in Brazil. And so I was wondering if there was any use of this kind of data and what reaction to that would be, but it's a measure that was basically established in 1976 by French economists and has been used by others, but it certainly has not caught the attention of the news media. But in basic logical terms, it's quite simple. In Brazil, it's been claimed that the bottom 10% has increased, doubled their income or so, whereas the top 10% has increased their income by about 20%. In relative terms, of course, the inequality is declining. But if you put it in absolute terms, it's an absolute increase still. So I just wanted to see what your reactions were to that, and if you have been using this kind of data as well in this study.
Okay, why don't we, shall we go in the order that we presented? And I think we have about 4 minutes each.
Okay. I would like to start by thanking David Lamb for the excellent comments and reinterpretation of the results. And I think we agree that supply is a factor that has to be taken into consideration, the supply of education, to explain the reduction of income inequality in Brazil through the reduction of wage differentials. I think also that we should take into account other factors. So, of course, supply is not the only factor. So, as David pointed out, demand shocks might also interfere with the process. And the fact that the supply and wages are negatively correlating doesn't mean that demand doesn't have a role. And so we should put more effort in trying to explain the evolution of the demand for education as well over the whole period, as there's a book about the US, Goldin and Katz, and the race between technology and education. And it would be interesting to complement the analysis by looking at what happened to the demand for high school in Brazil over this period, what happened to the demand for college education, which kind of college education. I think this would complete the picture. I think it's very interesting. And it is true also that the returns to college with respect to illiterates have been declining over the last few years. I prefer to focus on relative groups, but it would be interesting, I agree, to have the whole picture to show that even a college-educated person with respect to illiterate, this wage ratio has been declining as well. In terms of the other questions, the returns to college, I think the last point you made is exactly right. So the average is 3 times the wage ratio between someone with college and high school. But there is a lot of heterogeneity around this average. So if you graduate from a public university, perhaps there's no data in Brazil to do that. It's impossible to know what the returns are to USP or to a private education because no one collected this data. But since it's 200%, and since only a small proportion of these graduates come from public universities, I suspect that there is a big differential even for private, those that go to private college as well. So I would say that these 3 times is an average that perhaps reflect a huge returns to public universities and a smaller returns to the vast majority that goes to the private college. But those smaller returns are also big. They're not like zero going to private education. So this is just an average. In terms of capital cities and small cities, I think this education expansion occurred a lot in the interior of Brazil as well. And it would be interesting to look at the factors determining this expansion. I suspect that the Bolsa Família and Bolsa Escola has a role to play in the more poorer areas in the Northeast to expand education. And there are also some programs like the change in the constitution that decentralized access to education. The Fundef program, which changed the way education is funded in small municipalities. All these changes meant that education, most of this expansion, I think, occurred in the small cities and in the rural areas and in the more recent period. So I think this is interesting. In terms of China, I think China is in a phase, that's my interpretation, where you have increase in access, but increase in inequality. Why? Because the experience of China now is like Brazil in the 60s and 70s, I think. It was the increase in demand and raising the returns to education. So it's like a Kuznets curve, where you have an increase in inequality, and then after a certain point, when the supply increases a lot, then you have the reduction in inequality. So China, this China increase in inequality now is like what happened in Brazil in the 70s and 80s, I think. And eventually, once the proportion of people with college increase a lot, then you have the reduction in inequality in the future, I think. And in terms of my last point would be in terms of policy. I think these policies to increase access to education are welcome. ProUni, for example, is being successful. And there is some evidence showing that the ProUni students have higher grades than other students, controlling for all the other socioeconomic characteristics. The FIES is more, the expansion of FIES is a bit more doubtful because there is evidence that lots of universities just switch paying students for FIES students because it was really advantage. So the government doesn't fail to pay you. So it's really it's really easy to do that. And then when the government cut FIES, then we all have all these bankruptcy problems in the private sector. So FIES is a bit more doubtful, but I think ProUni is important. And I think the last thing I want to say is the most important thing now is to improve the quality of basic education. This is where the bottleneck is now. So increase test scores, learning in secondary and high school education. We have seen some improvements in terms of quality in the 4th grade, in the primary education, but in the 8th grade and high school, there's no improvement at all. So you will only be able to increase access to college in engineering and medical and these really more difficult courses once you are able, from the early years, to increase the education quality and prospects of the poorer families. I think this is what is missing in Brazil to reduce inequality even further in the future. Thank you.
Okay, so let me try to answer. Also, I'd like to thank David's comments and the questions. So, as one thing you said, I totally agree, is like, in the beginning of this, this period, all the action was happening in the lower grades of education, and now the action, I mean, in terms of quantity of people, the bubbles show it very well. They are happening more in the middle of the schooling. I have another paper where I try to combine both things: the transition, inequality in transition with inequality in educational results. So, because when you talk about transitions, sometimes it's like if it is the same kind of thing, but it's not, because you have lots, people are moving up, and so the action is more important now, I would say, at the secondary level, or the completion of, as before was just to complete 4 years of education was a huge advantage, and now it's nothing. So it's changed a lot. So I totally agree with that. let's see here. As for inequality in regional terms, I think many things are happening at the same time. You know, like there is a huge migration. You know, the population is becoming more urban, going to the metropolitan areas, in part because they are looking for many better opportunities, and of course, among those, school opportunities, which are better in urban areas traditionally. But at the same time, you know, there is the schooling at the, you know, rural areas is improving as well, you know, with all sorts of policies, you know, focusing there, you know, for a smaller population, but there are more schools and everything else in rural areas, so transportation and all these things. So there are lots of things happening at the same time. So, but it's important. And we see also that this inequality, the regional inequality in terms of access to education is declining as well. So, I mean, in my paper, we had some ideas about that when you compare rural and urban areas. It's not like, you know, but you see that the inequality in these terms diminish across the period. So as for favelas, education access in favelas, I'm not sure, but I think that this is expanding as well. I don't know, maybe Eduardo has something to say about that, but I think the education in favelas is improving in terms, I mean, in terms of access to education. So, I mean, this is changing as well. So, increase in entrance at college. Someone asked something in this direction, and I tried to show it's not in the paper, so Dave didn't have a chance to discuss. But I think that when these levels are expanding, each one of them, they are getting more heterogeneous. You know, when you know, college is expanding a lot during the last decade, for example, but it's getting more heterogeneous. You have Reúne, that's you know, creating new schools, you know, and so, you know, many people with disadvantaged origins, you know, economic and social origins, are entering more in schools which are less prestigious than in schools which are more prestigious. So you have this horizontal stratification. It's very important to study this. You know, as Naesio said, we don't have many information about this. You know, the information I had here is like very, you know, for colleges, just the careers people completed, this is very little information, you know. But of course there is this horizontal difference. So when you look inside each one of the levels, you know, and this horizontal stratification, it's another way of talking about quality, you know, or different quality. It's one thing that happened, you know. You can complete, you know, high school in a good school and or in a bad school, or you know, and it makes a big difference. And I think that in Brazil we have this perverse system that, in general, the better primary and secondary schools are private in general. So, and if you look at the enrollment at these levels, you see that the big expansion, for example, is secondary education was public secondary education, not private secondary education, you know. And when you go to the university is the reverse. The big expansion of universities in private universities, you know, you have a few schools which are good, like INSPER or FGV or PUCs, but most of them are not very high quality. And of course, there is also heterogeneity at the public sector, but it's a perverse system, because if you go to a very good private high school, you have high chances, and I have also a paper about that. You know, it's very strong, the chances of entering, you know, the university, and probably entering public universities. So, and if you come from a public school, you know, your chances are better to enter private, public high schools. Their chances are better to enter private college, although this is probably changing too, but it's a perverse thing. Some things in the educational inequality are, you know, defined by design, as Naesio said. For example, historically, you know, the primary education was financed by municipalities, which are the poorest in the federation, and then secondary education by states, and then college education by federal government. So it's like this change with Fundef, but it's is something that, you know, it's important to take into account. I don't know if I answered everything.
I just have one quick point. Since nobody mentioned the relative versus absolute inequality, I did want to make a point at that because it goes back to the big theme of don't lose sight of the progress that's been made. So if you had, it is true, and having set salaries as economics department chair, people do note that if everybody gets the same proportional increase, the already high salary people get more absolute increase. But if you had to generalize about what's happening in the world, especially in the middle income countries and the better off lower income countries, it's that inequality is going up and poverty is going down. And if you look at the growth rate of incomes by deciles, the high income wages are growing faster than the low income wages. Brazil and Latin America are the opposite of that. And many people, I was talking to Sergio before about, you know, a lot of people haven't heard that story yet. They think the whole world is this wages growing faster at the top. In Brazil, wages are going faster at the bottom. So that's an amazing thing. That's like going against the whole world. Now, they're not growing fast enough to offset the big absolute differences that were already there, but you know, that's asking a lot. So just having the wages growing, you know, 5 times faster in the bottom decile than the top decile, that's amazing.
Well, thank you all for a really illuminating panel. I'm going to turn it back to Paulo, but before we do that, why don't we thank the panel? Thank you.
Well, lunch is served outside. It's kind of free lunch, but it's not, because you have to go there, get your lunch, come back here, because we are going to continue doing lunch. See, and we are going to gain some time also, hopefully. Thank you very much.